Hello and welcome to The Ruffian with me, Ian Leslie. I'm delighted to say that my guest for this episode is Cass Sunstein. Cass is a professor at Harvard Law School and one of America's preeminent legal scholars. He's been an advisor to President Obama and President Biden, and he's the author of numerous excellent books on all sorts of topics, from behavioural economics to conspiracy theories to fame to climate justice. This conversation was sparked by his latest book on liberalism, a re-examination of what it means to be a political liberal in an age when liberalism is under attack. Cass is brilliant at making connections between politics and culture, which is why I wanted to talk to him about the Beatles and to what extent they can be said to embody a liberal outlook on life. We start off by talking about his first love, Bob Dylan. This is free for all, but paid subscribers get a bonus episode where we range further. We talk about whether the Beatles simply got lucky, and on a different topic, whether AI models should be able to use copyrighted material to train their models. I loved this conversation, and I hope you do too. Cass Sunstein, welcome to The Ruffian.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Cass, you don't discuss the Beatles in your book on liberalism, but you do make a few references to Bob Dylan, and I thought we'd start there. In what way can Bob Dylan be said to embody 20th century liberalism?
He went electric like a lot of times, once famously, but at least 6 other times. And the notion of self-invention and of not being tied to any particular tradition unless you want to be is very liberal. Like a Rolling Stone is a liberal anthem. What it does is it takes the state of rootlessness and on your own, like a complete unknown, and turns that into an anthem of joy and victory rather than as a state of horror and terror. And Dylan did that amazingly. Maggie's Farm is a liberal song, and he sang that to the folk world as well as, I think, to himself. And the basic idea is not working on Maggie's Farm is a reflection of individual agency big time. The song Isis, which is a song about travels and romance, is a liberal song about connection and disconnection and back again. So his liberalism goes really deep. His feeling of being eager not to be stuck, that folk music is kind of bald old people. I think he didn't really mean it quite like that as a semi-bald young person. I like to think that. It's about agency and autonomy. And when he sang to the UK, when they started booing one of his electric songs, he said famously, "Play it fucking loud." That's a liberal moment.
It's really interesting because I think most people would answer the question if they hadn't thought about it as deeply as you have. They would say, well, yes, of course he's a liberal. He campaigned against, he campaigned for civil rights. He wrote "The times are a changing." He was a kind of central part of the liberal messages of the 60s. But you're saying something more profound than that, which is that he kind of embodied in his music and in his whole career a sense of freedom to invent and reinvent yourself. Is that a fair summary?
Completely. So there's a lot to say about this. So there's liberalism as in left of center of the 60s, and then there's the liberal political tradition with John Stuart Mill being a primary expositor and Benjamin Constant in France. And the idea of Dylan being a liberal because he was kind of civil rights adjacent or friendly, squirming on his behalf, as he himself squirmed, that he said, that this kind of thing, this is dead people. And of course, I'm for civil rights and I identify with that movement in terms of substantive politics. But Dylan's music was not really about anything like protest songs. So protest songs, the very idea kind of disgusted him. And when he stopped singing political songs, people said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Everything I write is protest songs," which was in a way of middle finger in the air. But it was also a deep truth that everything he was writing was a protest song. On The Times They Are a-Changin', he said, that people think it's about generations, but that's not what it was. That was the only framework I had for distinguishing between being alive and being dead. And his conception of being alive was the antonym of thinking, some slogan about stopping a war or about something involving a cause. For him, those, he liked those causes, but to live there was to live in a very shallow part of the human soul, he thought. And the deeper part of the human soul is captured in Shelter from the Storm, You're Gonna Make Me Lonesome When You Go. Those are songs that are real, and they don't have the thinness. Now, their reality is connected with the liberal political tradition and the commitment to, let's say, I don't want to use words that are cornball words that would make the Dylan student, that is me, feel self-hatred, but something like some version that isn't dead of the word authenticity, which is a liberal
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, and authenticity to an individual, I mean, to himself rather than to a group, right? Because as I understand it, and I'm not a Dylan expert at all, but part of the falling out with the folk guys early on is about them saying, look, this music isn't about any one person. It's about a collective. It's about the group. It's about the working class. It's not about you, Bob. And him saying, well, actually, I would quite like to write about me, or at least express my own individual. I don't want to stand for a group. I only want to stand for myself. Is that fair?
I don't think that's really right.
Uh-huh.
I think it sounds too narcissistic and self-involved. And
Yeah.
if you look at um, great literature, would you say Shakespeare was self-involved or writing about himself?
Mm.
No. Was John Milton doing that in Paradise Lost? William Blake, is he self-involved in writing about himself? I mean, I don't think that captures it. So there's something, of course, connected with the self about take your favorite of his songs. Going back to Buckets of Rain, which I quite like, and Shelter from the Storm, and some from Blood on the Tracks, which are quite personal songs, but they're not really, in a sense, but they're really about, grief and loss. And there's a song called Abandoned Love, which is, he never put it on a record, but it's one of his greatest. And in a way, it's about a breakup and about freedom, but it's about something that isn't like the little surface of the brain that is sometimes involved when people say slogans that they've said 1,000 times, so much so that they've lost their meaning. And if you say something about breaking up with someone whom you love and the grief associated with that, then it can connect with something real in people. Now, this outruns liberalism. In fact,
Yeah.
you could illiberal or anti-liberal. It might not be political in any sense, but in Dylan's hands, it is frequently political in some sense. So I think the idea he's exploring himself, that would be as cheapening of his electric work as it would be cheapening of his folk music to say it's really about Vietnam.
He is anti-identity politics. I mean, but and in a sense of he doesn't want to be associated with a particular group, but also, as you've been saying, almost doesn't want to be associated with himself or like some sort of fixed idea of who he is. He always wants to be escaping whatever idea that you might have about him. Is that right?
I think almost, or it's not wrong, but I think it's not the exact way to put it. I think when he does, let's say, uh, a song about uh, Lady Lay, which is kind of a corny song. The song is about what the song is about, and it has a lot of
Yeah.
emotion there. It's not about it's about itself. It Ain't Me, Babe, which is hilarious, and both a song to a lover for whom things should be fun rather than fixed, and about, I think, his audience. It's a cri de coeur, that amazing song. It's not didactic like that. It's about itself. So Isis, which is, I think, his most romantic song, with a kind of staggering last stanza of unbearably intense emotion. It's about itself. Now, when he said after he abandoned folk music, and I'm thinking now about a song, Abandoned Love, he said, I could do this forever. I could just do those songs, and I knew exactly what the audience would do and when it would do it. And he said, I could just kept doing that. But he said it with, that's like doing the push-ups, and there's no life in it. And so
And how?
yeah. So it's yeah.
Sorry, I was going to ask, and so just make the connection back to liberalism for me.
Okay. Okay. So there's a part of the liberal tradition, let's say, which is about autonomy and agency. And Mill's, both the subjection of women and on liberty, are about the stultifying effect of conformity. In one case, the subordination of women who were put into a role, which, etc. And in the case of On Liberty, it's both the state and conformist pressures pushing people into molds. And kind of the energy of On Liberty, and I think the subjection of women too, is the cherishing of individual agency. And that's a long-standing liberal idea. You can find it in some forms in John Rawls' theory of justice. You can find it in the libertarian strand associated with Hayek and Nozick. And there's Dylan is a songwriter. He's not a political theorist, but the animus, let's say, of Dylan's going electric first, but also on multiple occasions, is about not being stuck in something. So
Yes.
the what a lot of the liberals see as a nightmare is the human spirit crushed. So here's another way to put it. I'm struggling a little bit with these fantastic questions. 1984 is a really liberal text. And there's a family resemblance between Orwell's sensibility in 1984 and Dylan in Maggie's Farm, where they're both about crushing of the spirit. What Orwell gets that Dylan, he has his elbow out so he doesn't get it, is the erotic appeal of the anti-liberal vision. So what makes Orwell's 1984 so phenomenal is that it's a liberal text, which is anti-tyranny, but the erotic appeal of tyranny is front and center. And the more you read it, the more it's kind of threatening to overwhelm the book even.
Yeah, it's a bit like the devil in Milton, like Satan.
Completely,
Yeah.
completely. And William Blake, an occasionally liberal thinker, said the reason Milton wrote in fetters when speaking of God and heaven, and at liberty when speaking of Satan and hell, is that he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. Now, Blake was a devout person, and he didn't really believe that, but some part of his poetic heart kind of saw that as a thing. And when Dylan says, play it fucking loud, he's partaking of a kind of energy that at least some liberals recognize as part of our species. This could be, by the way, a religious position, and in Dylan's hands, it sometimes is.
Yeah, and we'll move on from Dylan in a minute, but is there a sense in which makes me think that one of the crucial things about liberalism is that there is a lot of what matters, perhaps what really matters in life, is beyond politics. So in a way, that is kind of liberal politics, is to say that actually politics tends to get you stuck, it tends to kind of put you into a box, and you know.
Well, yes, it's good to distinguish between two conceptions of liberalism. This kind of a 20th century distinction. There's political liberalism, which says we want freedom, most prominently freedom of speech and religion. We want the rule of law, and we want respect for pluralism. That's kind of liberalism's holy trinity. And you can believe in those three things and think that, Dylan's conception of agency and Maggie's Farm, that's terrible. What we should all be doing is really following traditions, or at least what many people should be doing, and they really should be working on Maggie's Farm forever. That's what they should do. That's their duty. That's their life. And you can think that and think that the liberal political ideals of freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law are admirable, and hooray for them, and boo for Russia and communism and fascism. But then there's another part of the liberal tradition, sometimes described as perfectionist rather than political, which sees a life as one of self-invention and autonomy. The political liberals are very nervous about the perfectionist liberals. They think that they're taking on board a conception of the good life, and liberals shouldn't do that. You could think that autonomy and agency are properly owned by all of us, and also think that people shouldn't be political all the time or much unless they really want to, but they should be free. And that means if you're working on Maggie's Farm, it has to be because that's what you want to do, not because it's what's expected or, you don't have any alternative.
So talking about freedom, no direction home, that to me, there's some connection there between the that song and that sentiment with Paul McCartney. When Paul McCartney sings in is it "You Never Give Me Your Money"? Oh, that magic feeling, nowhere to go. I always feel like it's the sort of echo of Dylan in that line, and of course, there's a lot of connections between the Beatles and Bob Dylan. But yeah, let's move on to the Beatles. You talked about pluralism. Yeah, even more than Dylan, maybe they embody a pluralist ethos. I mean, first of all, they're a group and not a solo act. That's fundamental difference between them, and it's interesting to think about the political in the wider sense implications of that. And also when it came to their music, they were, of course, determined to draw on an incredible diversity of sources and traditions, and that kind of connected to, I guess, their kind of political outlook in the wider sense. Yeah, so I wanted to, if you see them like leaning into pluralism in that sense, perhaps more so than Dylan.
Okay, so this is a fantastic question. So the Beatles certainly are pluralistic in their sources and interests. And that's, is there any other musician or group who has that? Offhand, no. And, it could be within the space of a single album. Think of Revolver, even Rubber Soul, and the appreciation and admiration of many. So they're pluralistic in that sense. I think their liberalism consists partly in their sensibility. So Twist and Shout, one of my favorites, Lennon's version, they didn't write it, but Lennon's version is just bursting with a liberal spirit of freedom and defiance, something like that, which turns into the word joy is too terrible to be the right word, but if
Yeah,
There's probably a German word for it.
Yeah,
It's
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 unavoidable.
it's not a Lenin word. So
Yeah.
Lenin's, and I love your point that there are four of them. And I'm thinking that George has two songs that are kind of liberal in more than one way. One is Only a Northern Song. I think that's George's. Correct me if I'm wrong. And the
Yes,
other is
it is. Yeah.
and Taxman.
Yeah.
Those are kind of liberal in the sense they're kind of like Maggie's Farm. Uh, John's sensibility, which had defiance in it and breaking free of constraints, which I think is, help in a different way, is doing that. Um, John, I find, as I've been thinking about it, partly to get to talk to you, I love them all, but John's sensibility might be my favorite, and his is it has the most liberal energy. But of course, Paul does too. And Paul's, I don't know, amazement at his own, and I saw her standing there, his own virtuosity. And it's not a bragging amazement, it's just kind of into it amazement. That captures something about liberalism and agency.
Yes, that's really interesting. And I can sort of see, you might say, if let's put rule of law aside for a moment, that if pluralism and freedom are the two core values of liberalism, then, John and Paul, I mean, both stand for both, but you could, maybe Lennon leans a bit more into freedom and McCartney leans a bit more into pluralism. It's McCartney who's the one who was insisting from very early on that we can play absolutely anything, that all music is equal to all other music, effectively. Whereas Lennon is just this incredible radical, right, in his musical invention and his personality. Um,
But that's
and
really interesting. So maybe we pause over it and talk
Yeah.
about the liberal sensibility, which has many forms. There's Dylan has anger, and so does Lennon.
Mm,
McCartney much less.
hmm.
So this shows in their songs. I think not that I know, but I think McCartney kind of appreciated Lennon's anger and
Yes.
it freed him a bit, and
Yes.
maybe Lennon appreciated McCartney's sunniness, and it maybe calmed him a bit.
Yeah.
The Lennon's anger is associated at least with one form of liberalism, and I'm thinking there's the words. One of my favorites is "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away," which it's a very complicated song, and it captures something about private and public and liberalism. I take your point about pluralism, and McCartney is just so open. It's like he's a genius of channel, even more than Dylan, a genius of channeling various traditions. So he's open to pluralism in that sense. And I'm wondering whether this is a deep connection with liberalism and pluralism, or whether it's a pun. So I'm just not sure. So there's pluralism like lots of traditions, and then there's pluralism as in if people want to be carpenters, go for it. If they want to be poets, or if they want to be construction contractors, like my dad was, go for it. If they want to, devote their life to religion, that's completely fine, or not, that's also fine. So that's one conception of pluralism. Then there's pluralism like being open to lots and lots of traditions. And I'm not sure whether these are deeply the same thing or whether they are different things with the same word.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I mean, I do think it's interesting that the liberal, where they get almost political. I mean, one of the interesting things about them is that they're very rarely directly political. They're sort of anti-political in some ways. But when they do lean into it a little bit, it tends to be McCartney songs, I think, where in Blackbird, which he says is about civil rights. I'm not 100% I believe him about that, but he says that was inspired by civil rights. Obla Di, Obla Da, which is about immigrants and, making a good life for themselves and everyone being happy together at a time when, of course, it was incredibly controversial in Britain. And then Get Back, we saw them discuss Enoch Powell in the context of the song Get Back. So they were kind of leaning into openness and diversity and pluralism in a quite explicitly political sense in the late 60s as well tended to come from Paul. So I think that's quite interesting. By the way, you mentioned Taxman. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. You said it was liberal. In fact, it might be the first neoliberal, maybe the only neoliberal protest song, because it's about tax cuts. Are basically arguing for tax cuts, and it's also funny. You know, there's a lot of Beatles songs which are funny, right? And comedy and laughter completely central to the group's ethos. And you do say when you're going through, you have a kind of a brilliant list of things that you associate with liberalism, that laughter is very important to the liberal tradition. Could you say a bit more about that, and then we'll kind of connect it back to the Beatles?
Yeah. Okay. So there's making people laugh, which is often irreverent and uh, an exercise of agency. And there's also laughing, which is receptive. So there are certain non-liberal or anti-liberal people who are very reluctant to be made to laugh because there's a vulnerability in that. The liberal tradition is full of fun. So if you look at uh, great liberal thinkers, there's often wit and a joke or an aside in what they write, or there's a dig that has some funniness in it. And this is a liberal tradition that includes, people who are on the political right, but who are committed to freedom, etc. I think the humor of the Beatles, it's a liberal spirit where they're trying to make people laugh. It's often irreverent. It's sometimes, it's always connected, and there's something there that's not authoritarian. So, or authoritarian leaders, it's very hard to make them laugh. Sometimes they will try to make you laugh, but it's mean laughter or laughter at how contemptible someone else is. And the Beatles, offhand, contempt isn't a thing. Anger occasionally, but much less than Dylan. They're I don't know. There's something democratic with a small d, and that's one reason I was around at the time the Beatles took over America. We recognize them as democratic with a small d, and also full of fun and an ability to connect. So even songs like "I Want to Hold Your Hand" and "She Loves You," where the lyrics are a little less interesting, the songs burst with something, which is they're funny. And I saw her standing there is pretty simple lyrics, but there's the you know what I mean. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, I totally agree, and you see that strand of humour all the way through. And actually, Lennon, I mean, Lennon, they're all funny individuals. Lennon, perhaps more than any of them, when he was on form, if he was in a good mood. There's a great quote from Lennon, which I might just read to you, because it stuck in my mind when I heard it, because he made it during around 1969, I think, when he's doing the kind of campaigning with Yoko Ono. So he's got quite serious, in inverted commas. He's getting overtly political, and he wants to hang out with the radicals, but he doesn't want to let go of his sense of humor. And he says this to an interviewer: when it gets down to having to use violence, and of course, yeah, we should talk about his attitude to violence. It's very ambivalent about it. When it gets down to having to use violence, then you're playing the system's game. The establishment will irritate you, pull your beard, flick your face to make you fight. Because once they've got you violent, they know how to handle you. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humour. And he goes on to say, it's really important to keep your sense of humour because the establishment don't like that. I thought that was an interesting
Yeah, I like the
take.
last part. The rest of it seems very, what's the right word? Very baked and
Yeah,
not his most interesting self. So use of the word the establishment, that's not John Lennon at his best, I think. And
yeah,
that they want to make you and violence, you're playing their game. That sounds a little like some uh, conversations I had with radical friends in my teens, And I want to say, come on, John, you're better than that.
Yeah. He always had this sense that one part of him, I think, around this period wanted to be with the cool guys who always, would say, let's get radical, let's get on the streets. And then, but also is fundamentally a non-violent, or actually he wasn't, because he could be violent in his personal life, but I think he kind of deeply regretted that. And there's that famous sort of compromise he makes in the song Revolution, where he says, you can count me out in. It's always kind of on that borderline. I sense that he's fundamentally a liberal and is a little bit embarrassed about it.
It's a great question. So liberalism as a kind of ethos that prizes agency and freedom, I think that is Lenin's sensibility. I think all of them in different ways. Lenin the most kind of defiant, and McCartney the most genial. Ringo pretty genial too. So there's that.
Yeah.
When he got political in this period, it's a little like Dylan in reverse, I think, where Dylan abandoned the kind of political adjacent stuff in favor of something he thought, I don't know even what the right word is, less canned and less stuck. So, and Lennon at certain points got more, I regret to say, because he's a hero of mine, more canned and stuck. I love what you say about Revolution. I think it's just a great song, but also it's very interesting. You can count me in, out, you can count me, and his own ambivalence about it. But the question whether violence is the right reaction to social terribleness, that's a really important question. My own view is almost never, though I'm speaking from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a home of the American Revolution, so never is not the right answer, but almost never. I think the Beatles' engagement with that, or John Lennon's engagement with that, was a detour a bit. I mean, Imagine, which people really love. I find as I go through the list that as much as I love McCartney, the number of Lennon songs that are my favorite is a bit higher than the McCartney songs that are my favorite. But the Rolling Stones' Street Fighting Man is a really good 60s song. And it's kind of a liberal song. And it's more like a tale than some of Lennon's efforts. So the fact that it's a story and it paints a picture of a guy, and it's funny, like what's a poor boy, one of the lines exactly, to do except to sing for a rock and roll band. That's funny for a rock and roll band to sing it. But the animus of it is, there's something political in it, and there's something a little like Maggie's Farm in Street Fighting Man. And I'm thinking that Lennon and McCartney, they didn't write offhand, they didn't write a song quite like that. But as you say, Blackbird has a feeling in it and maybe content that are of a political character. And there are plenty of songs, Help. I love that. And In My Life, which is a Lennon elegiac, Norwegian Wood, which is one of my all-time favorites, I confess. Is that a liberal song? In a way, it's about it. It's not a conventional song, and it's got maybe betrayal in it.
Well, we touched on this already, but this idea of experiments in living and encouraging many different experiments in how to live, being a strand of liberalism is really interesting. And I say the Beatles were offering, you could see them as offering different ways to be in the world. Through these incredible transformations that they go through, that we all talk about. As they go from the four guys in suits in 1963 through to Sergeant Pepper. They go to India. They talk about drugs. They're dressing differently. They're wearing their hair differently. So they're almost embodying this sense of, you can experiment and keep experimenting in the way they dress and in their music, more flamboyantly and more directly than Dylan during the 60s even, perhaps. What do you think about that?
That's great. I'm thinking Dylan, I think, would be embarrassed to do some of the things they did.
Oh, yeah.
What's that about? Is it that there were four of them? Is that they're more fun. So Dylan can be fun, but that's not the first word that would come to mind. The Beatles are really fun, both their music and you can see them kind of egging each other on to do things that are new. And so that's part of it. Let's talk about, shall we? Thank you for raising the experiments and living idea. This comes from Mel, who appreciated experiments in living and thought that a liberal society would allow people to have them. Now, I think what made Mill's work so, almost like music at times, and so, enduring, is that it had an autobiographical feature that he had this, extremely intense love affair with Harriet Taylor, which originally was illicit. She was married. What exactly happened between them while she was married, unclear. But when he ended up with her, it was a scandal, and things were very difficult with his family. And the idea of conformity pressures as a form of tyranny, Mill was speaking personally as well as for the ages about that. And that led him to think, let people experiment. So he experimented with Taylor, like in a couple of different ways. And I think he thought that's the most important and best thing in his life. And am I going to be deprived of that? And are others? And then there's the politicization of the idea, where if people want to, be musicians, or if they want to be writers, or if they want to sell shoes, liberal societies say do all those things. If they want to try to invent something new, they can try that. They might fail, and the economics might not work out so well. The Beatles lived, as you're saying, experiments in living, and maybe some of their appeal, in retrospect, and you write about this, the amazingness of seeing in such a short time the number of things that were different that they embraced.
Yes, and they were more willing to talk about their lifestyle choices, including LSD and drugs and so on. The other question I'm sort of pondering is whether or not, and again, it's the Dylan comparison is so interesting, whether or not they have a different relationship to their audience than Dylan, and maybe so they don't follow their audience, they lead their audience. They're not going to give you the same album as last time because you loved that one, but now we're going to give you something different and you're going to come with us. And Dylan is similar, but Dylan has this seemingly a more aloof attitude, where it's really like, I don't really care what you think. I don't think that's quite right, but can you tease out what's going on there and the difference in the way they relate to their audience?
Yeah, I have a son who's 17 years old, who, when he was maybe 11, would say with mischief about a person, "Is he a good guy?" Paul McCartney, by all appearances, is a really good guy. And Ringo Starr, by all appearances, is exactly the same. The Beatles as a team, maybe George and John are more complicated figures in terms of good guyness, but I think George for sure, yes, and John much of the time an aspiring yes. So as a team, they are a good guy. Is Bob Dylan a good guy? That's
Mm.
much less clear. I worked at the White House under President Obama, and Dylan got some award or Presidential Medal of Honor or something like that, and I was there, and there was no sense that Dylan wanted to meet people and shake their hands or had any interest in warm engagement with even the President of the United States. I think he was very willing to meet President Obama, but it wasn't as if he was fawning and with. So there we go. Whereas Paul McCartney
Yeah.
and Ringo Starr famously, and I think this is connected with how they are with their audiences. So um, Dylan loves his music and he loves making music, evidently. Whether he loves his audience, that's most unclear. There's a kind of the Beatles are very warm as a group, so they might say, we liked Rubber Soul, here's Revolver, and now here's Sergeant Pepper's. But they were, of course, following their own artistic muse, which might or might not map onto what people wanted, and that links them with Dylan and many others who, if you think about what does the audience want, that's going to maybe destroy your creativity.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I wonder if there's yeah, is there a kind of a lesson about liberalism or democracy there? Because in a way, I don't know. There's a kind of democracy. The Beatles feel democratic in some ways, partly because they are a little internal democracy, right? They're a group of four different, purposeful, strong-willed people who somehow become, make something work together. And whereas Dylan is less democratic in that sense, just because he is who, he's just one of him. But I don't know. I'm sort of rambling here, but I wonder if there's just in this relationship to the audience, you've got kind of two different components of what you need in a liberal or even just a democratic politician, which is you need to be listening and people, you need to some extent give them what they want, but you also have to recognize that they want you to lead and they don't want to just be given what they want.
Okay, so this is great. Abraham Lincoln, in attacking slavery, said that if a white man rules himself, that's freedom. If a white man is in charge of a slave, that's tyranny. And that offends the sheet anchor, he called it, of American republicanism, which is we get to govern ourselves. So he had a conception of democracy was that no one's a slave, we govern ourselves. And that connected with the American enthusiasm for republicanism, small r, as opposed to monarchy, so no titles of nobility. And that's connected, I think, with liberalism. Some liberals are not as excited about democracy as I think the main strand, but that's a liberal commitment. The Beatles very democratic in this sense. Famously, John Lennon singing before the Queen said, the people in the front, clap your hands, those rattle your jewelry, the people in the back. And that was a democratizing moment. It was taking down a peg. The wealthy people, rattle your jewelry, and it was charming. It wasn't mean.
Mm.
You're asking a great question about artists and their relationship to their audience. It does seem right. Both Dylan and the Beatles were leading their audiences. It wouldn't be right to say that either was collaborating with their audiences. I'm not sure what to think about Dylan when he, went from Electric and then did John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. The first is very low key and kind of a return to folk. The second is country. I don't know what he was doing with his audience. He said at one point, "This is all I had, really. I wish I could have done more music. This is all I had." I think that's probably right. The Beatles seem to have, certainly early, they had such joy with their audiences. They loved performing. And as I understand, when they broke up, it was partly they weren't performing anymore. It was all in the studio. And that they didn't like that nearly as much. I mean, Paul was endlessly inventive and a hard worker. So he'd bring them into the studio, but somehow interacting in ways that they could hear the audience and see the audience. And when John talked about the Beatles, his happiest facial expressions were in the early days, like in Liverpool and Munich, when
Yeah.
they were becoming great. And it really was an interactive thing. Those of us who, like I have negative musical talent, can't really appreciate, except maybe a little tiny bit imaginatively, what would be like to interact. But you could see on tape when they could, it was a collaborative thing. Now, Dylan could be very funny with the audience. He could be a performer when he was young. Now he doesn't interact much at all.
But he's such a contradiction because people always think of him as, aloof, arrogant. Oh, Bob doesn't care what his fans think. He doesn't care what audiences think. He was always just doing his own thing. But he's the guy who's been playing, 100 gigs a year every year of his life. He just never stops. He wants to be in front of an audience all the time, right? He doesn't have to do that. So
I want to think about that. It's a great puzzle. I mean, in one interview, he said, "Why are you out there all the time?" And he said, "I made a deal." And someone said, the interviewer said, "A deal with whom?" And he said, "Well, the one you can't see." So it's like he made a deal with God that he would be doing this. But it might be that he feels
God or
dead.
Satan.
Yeah, well, I think he meant God, but it might be that he felt dead or scared. He feels dead or scared when he's not on stage or when he's not performing or useless. Who knows what it could be? I take your point that people think of him as aloof or something. I don't think any of those are the right words. I think he's intensely shy. He's not an extrovert. A little scared. He's funny that when he goes out to dinner, people will say to him, "You're not him," and he'll go like that, and he'll say, "You're really not him." And then they'll say, "You're him." And then he'll say, "Well, I am." And then they'll say, "You're not him." And these are very tiring conversations about whether he's him or not. And it must be, I think Paul is so, Paul seems to get energy from others. Who knows? But he's so uh, uh, funny and fun and kind in at least recorded conversations. And you know much more about this than I do, infinitely more. But he seems to be, democratic small d in his character, not in his ideology. That's
Exactly.
also in that, but in his character.
Also in that, but in his character, yeah, fundamentally, some profound way. There's something, yeah, intensely democratic about his personality, and he takes huge joy in an audience and in an audience's happiness and in collective happiness kind of being enacted in front of him, when he's playing those
And keep,
stadium
keep in
gigs.
mind, that's great. My understanding is I haven't seen McCartney in person, but my understanding is even today, and he's so good even today that to use the words even today is not fair. He's amazing in front of an audience. I've had friends who've seen him and, in his 80s, and they say he's incredible. And I haven't heard that about Dylan. They say it's a fantastic experience, but they don't say he's incredible.
I think it sounds amazingly variable with Dylan. So let's round off by let me just ask you a question I haven't prepared you for. It might be difficult to answer, which is, do you have a favorite Beatles album, and if so, which one?
Revolver.
Ah, it is Revolver.
Yeah,
And why Revolver?
well, maybe partly it was the first album I ever got, but I think it's
Mm.
just fantastic. I love Rubber Soul almost as much, and I've just seen a face is kind of an unforgettably great song. Revolver.
Yes, yes, yes. Um, yeah, I would find it hard to pick between those two.
Those are
Although
much.
yeah.
I mean, Rubber
That
Soul
was
might
wonderful.
be.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Rubber Soul's cleaner, might be better, but I think Revolver's my favorite. Depends
Yeah,
on the day.
yeah. Cass Sunstein, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating and a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
talk to you.
Great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.